character concept, who has the power infused as green, but the power of green is empowered by the power of yellow, and the power of yellow is the yellow light. Thus, red is stop, yellow is slow down, and green means go, and thus the act of the active assist becomes the primary target in all functions into every mission in full diversity, such as, but it's not limited to, the video games such as League of Legends, where the function becomes support as much as possible. And thus, this even includes the action of a high kill grade character, which would then whittle down the parties in favor of promoting the allies who have been specifically assigned as the primary direct front forces. And to that end, you have examples like in the season of Lioness, the episode Choice of Failure, which specifically outlines many of the types of concepts which would have actively been infused in the Boss Baby, as the Legend of David character maintains the active infusement of the projections of those seeking to make their fortune by actively attaching to successes, which then would promote in collaboration their maximum output of wealth, which then becomes the function of the broker to engage in decelerating their own position in order to hyper-accentuate the studies and findings for the function of those higher grade contracts, which they would then sell and distribute to those contacts or clients, which then would materialize the function of actively maximizing the output of that for the common ingestion of commissions, as the decelerated position includes the full anxieties of engaging in the research and preparations and data analysis, which then facilitates the active support for the clients, who would then maximize their opportunities by the exchanging of contracts such as the right of working, which then would materialize their sub-portion contract for each season, which would commonly be broken down to quarters, and thus the function of each season being in a set of 3 months would materialize each duration of contract schedules on the earlier bits for consistent work, which then would actively be distributed from David's church, which would actively seek the ingestion of more workers who are out of their luck in order to engage in the support and acceleration of those various alternative options as they're on a contract schedule for rehabilitation and the normalization and reintroduction into society, which is a presumption that already exists, including the presumption of Howard Duvall's position on the board of Oregon's mental health system, which would also include the presumption of the hate groups' capture of dawn and defamations and poisonings, which would require rehabilitations once rescued from the traffickers who were using the surveillance function, including the use of slave drugs such as roofies and roofies plus, etc., in order to break the mind and make them compliant in a series of harassment and struggling sessions under communist magic in order to facilitate them being captured, at which point they act as a proxy for all of the trades and exchanges for whatever their handlers want, at which point the handlers make all of the money and seek to discard the party as much as possible, facilitating the function of the need of rehabilitation centers, which in that situation, Don Sr., would have been ingested into if the United States had a functioning military, it would have acknowledged David's title and the things that he's owed and their obligation, first and foremost, to the Constitution, which requires the restoration of the title, which engages in the function of the duel, which then materializes David as intelligence oversight 6-star general status to enforce against the perpetrators, including but not limited to the president's contempt for Congress, such as the acts of unitary executive theory or other benign positions such as the modern encroachments from the illegitimate policies being passed by judges, by judicial activists who engage in the function of overexpanding the function of the executive at the detriment of co-equal branches for the complete eradication as an act of treason of checks and balances, as the function of their rebuffing is against the inconveniences of the contract obligations of their profession, which then is ignored in favor of the immediately convenient, which devolves into the function of normal day traders, which actively, historically, for the non-professionals, mostly lose their asses at. And the function of their active exchange and functions hyper promotes the potential of the incapable for being the primary day traders in that exchange, which covers for the same concept as the government executives functions at the highest levels, which then engages in the function of actively breaking down the system as it systematically loses all of its resources to the blind position, which then destroys the authority of the hierarchy as it hyper-decentralizes back into clan activities, which then becomes the exclusive function of the executive branch, which is a cosine historic development from the blueprints scientifically crafted by the Nazis, which had executive functions from specific branches which were beyond remedy, and thus the function of not having a remedy to a Nazi spell or a Confederate spell facilitates the rule by wizards construct, which only vaguely holds its loyalties to the hierarchy, but in the case of the Confederate rebellions, does not hold sway with the hierarchy. It holds sway with Jubilex and hyper-decentralization, as the Nazis were the pretty face of the Confederates, who built them from scratch, ordering them and the policies in order to construct, as well as the historic plots in order to destroy them, which made Hitler confident in the West's compliance with the agreement that they're sent in the contracts, which they were paid for by the United States in the trading that created the Great Depression, as the stock market collapsed by its over bad investments into helping out the Germans, was actually payment for the Nazis, as the contract stipulates that they weren't allowed to use it for military operations, which they were blatantly doing because the secret function of the unitary executive theory of the Confederate insurrection was the crafting of enemies of the United States in order to force the United States into the war, including the function of bullying Japan by stopping the trades to Japan, which it needed in order to stabilize its function, requiring them to engage in a military operation in order to fund the continuation of the action, which then forced them to make an alliance, an uneasy alliance with the Nazis, who were again under the Confederates' control, and thus the Confederates controlled the entirety of the problem, and thus the function of the problem of what do you do with all of these Nazis after the World War ends becomes irrelevant, because the thing that you do with them is not create them in the first place. So the excuse to have it is then subverted by itself, according to the Hegelian dialectic and other historic magic functions, including all of their other research in order to engage in their trickery and spells and subversions as their active con and malice. Having compromised the function of the secrets, they attacked what they did not have clearance for, clearly breaking through the function of the entire concept of clearances when it's convenient for enemies of the United States. At which point, their discovery of David's title in their Legend of David projections, discovered by various mechanisms, materialize the function of their preemptive attack, or punishments without crimes, or preemptive punishments under William Barr's insurrection for the Confederacy and its hatred of the United States. And thus the action of this active investment into corruption in order to engage in the eradication of all law and justice prevents the prerequisites of qualified law enforcement, which include service of law and the following of the protocols and the actions of assignments on how each of the things are supposed to happen, as there are protocols and limitations assigned to each and every function. And the act of breaking them in favor of not telling and defrauding the courts becomes the standard normalization of the insurrectionists and their Confederate rebellion. And to this extent, the entire process of discovering the Legend of David concept materializes back into that character, which then facilitates the embodiment of the peace child, which would then facilitate all of the trading in the brokerage, which would then have sold the contract schedules, which then would materialize the funding, which then would make the bonds in order to make the diplomatic peace agreement with the Soviet Union, which has infected the United States with the Confederates under the demoralizing program, as they're systematically converted to treason, fully disconnected from all rationality. And even if you show them base reality, there is no appeal with a remedy, as they are fully delusional and disconnected from all forms of responsibility, rationality, and reality, as their full disconnect from any systems that actually functionally have to exist. They are fully engrossed in the function of becoming the same type of marks as their religion dictates the Middle East was when it was fully converted by the Aryans, which led to their hyperextension of the creation of the demonic and others in order to have hyper-accelerated the power for the golden age of the Arabian societies, which then facilitated the hyper-specifically unique qualities in science, which then were shipped to the Druids, who religiously controlled everything, similar to the Catholic Church, except they don't have the functional Catholic Church activities. At which point, all of the nightmare type scenarios that they present in movies and so on about the nightmarish demonic sways about the Catholic Church would have actively been a base reality of those Druids, who are that base religion, which had to culturally be accepted into the Catholic Church as a sway in order to get the locals to convert to Catholicism. While they tried to destroy all of the records that they could find about them, they still had the imprint of the culture, which had to be converted, which then actively engaged in a mixture of Catholic Christianity and the function of their local cultures. As they converted this function, you materialize the activities which specifically developed their historic position as the last resort of the preservation of their religious text and identities, carried on as it had historically been carried on by reciting and word of mouth, and similar to the function of Aristotle and Plato's argument over the act of writing the thing down, as if you write it down, then it is permanent as a thing that can be reproduced to others, as opposed to the function of keeping it purely oratory, which means as long as it is viable for the general community to have the belief, then it will continue the exchange. and when it is no longer valuable, they just stop repeating it and it dissolves into the ether. To this extent, that would be the continuation of how they conducted this as an infection of culture and religion into the Catholic Church, which then engaged in the hyperacceleration of its systematic takeover of the system under the Frasuable religion, which then engaged in the function of creating the pedophile priests and the celibate priests and all of the things that created any negative appeal towards the Catholic Church was created by these cultural infections, which had already historically existed and had been the status quo. Uh, at which point, the function of having protected it being essential to having the capability of converting and saving the souls of people inside of that culture was the trade-off. Were those souls worth the sting of the potential of the infection? And it's a difficult question, and only in this case the Vicar of Christ would be able to create a justification one way or another, but in the end, the sensitivities and sympathies for the potential lost souls outweighs any potential risk, as the function of any of the risks are derived by the most educated and refined, and thus the most qualified to deal with it would be the ones handling the issue, as opposed to the unqualified who would not have access to the Word of God, which creates their moral dilemma, which they did as well as one could hope for, given the circumstances. This includes the function of its infusement into Laura Bailey's uh, role-playing game from the Secret Record, which has to make various adjustments to status quo rules which could be found in D&D and others. At which point, the act of creating modern-day versions of old-school things, such as the act of turning crossbows upgraded eventually into guns, facilitates the capacity of wizard infusements such as downgraded or downcasted versions of power word kill, at which point the act of aiming the gun would be the effectiveness of the downcast power word kill, which would either get a good aim and hit the person acquiring the kill, or missing and just simply injuring the person in an undesirable way at various degrees of success or damage. And this includes the function of the old Arthurian position of the sword and the stone, as the chosen can take the sword out of the stone, or in Marvel's comics, Thor can pick up Mjolnir, as the function of being worthy is an essential qualifier in order to be able to wield the thing. And to this extent, the act of it not being viable facilitates the ability of characters such as Guts or Zack or any of the others, who then could be a World Tree Barbarian, would pull up the sword and the stone together as a single thing, at which point their historic position of wielding the Buster Sword, which is the entire stone, which would be reforged specifically to their activities as they grow in strength and are capable of wielding such a hefty hue. And this huge jacked man materializes that unreasonable strength which would be essential for pulling off this most spectacular of feats. And also you would have the function of the chosen one in question being able to take the sword out of it, and thus the action would be similar to the function of what do you call it, of the Final Fantasy VII position of the several swords hidden in a single sword, like them put together mechanically as a single sheath, And thus, that kind of idea, being able to do with that arrangement, facilitates the capacity of the various compounding effects, as the taking of that would then facilitate the holding of the Excalibur type thing in question uh, for the various degrees of damages, at which point the hyper shield and the hyper sword, similar to the card in the Dracula games, or in the TV show, or in the video game simulation game where the primary uh, leader of the guild had a large shield and a large sword and was magic for some reason and was actively the creator of the game. That's one. Um, in that case, you would actively have the handle equipped to the sheath itself, becoming the shield in question, as they would add several complications in case of other complications such as special tools for the job or the act of needing to have many backup durability questions, as the ability for the swords to break would hyper be complicating the issues, especially back in the Iron Age, as the creation of steel uh, hadn't existed outside of the Vikings infusing their bones of their ancestors into the swords, which was the creation of steel, which would explain the consumption of the bones which they would have had from any of their various wars in the Middle East, which we know about. They're expanding into, at which point, if there was any unique type of humanoid in question, such as the creation of giants, it would be consumed by these types of mechanisms or eaten by one of the animals or something along these lines. At which point, this would actively be the excuse of many Nazi and other archaeologists pursuing the function of archaeology for their theocracy, or the active religious benefits of whatever they were pursuing, as their religion became the hyper promotion of the concept of their existence as a social cultural identity. This then supports the function of the character for all of the opponents of the West in the Confederacy, and thus the action of its counter function of the Legend of David, such as the active infusement of Odysseus, such as, but is not limited to, the function of the complications designed in the long-standing projected conflict or the war of attrition, which then qualifies the old question about the ship of Odysseus and the act of having to change all of the boards, and how many times do they have to change the boards before it stops being the ship of Odysseus, despite having to have replaced it. Was it the same ship? And the question is answered by yes, it is the same ship, as the qualifying situation is the possessor and not the object itself, and thus the action of it being the possession of materializes the solution, and thus the action, such as in the War on David, of the long-standing obstructed functions of it not being a constitutional authority of the government in Congress or the executive or the judiciary to facilitate the collapse of status by a war of attrition, as the function of status and human decency has to be preserved by the takings clause, and thus the action of replacing the status in the obstruction, and thus the action of the communist revolutionaries engaging in the contracts to obstruct and steal the function in order to leave or remain with the injuries is criminally forbidden as a function disqualified from official acts, and thus is in unofficial acts, and therefore has no authority to sustain itself, which is a part of the obstruction which prevents the sober educated answer of David, who is not capable of understanding the function of any of the engagements of the government without that sober educated answer, which requires the full control over the obstructed titles and all of its properties and faculties. Without the sober control over those, there is no possibility of an educated answer, and the contracts facilitating the obstructed education is the function of the education, and thus the title itself cannot manifest understanding an educated answer without the possession of the education, and thus the action of the redactions qualifies an infinite threat that prevents the possibility of understanding, and thus creates a permanent dilemma from the bondage and gags set against the patriarchy in order to overthrow the United States, in order to prevent the sober educated answer of the intelligence oversight six-star general, and those obstructions as contempt for Congress is insurrection, including but not limited to the double agents who have acquired voter fraud in order to infiltrate Congress itself in order that they may express their contempt for Congress in order to collapse the function of Congress into the Confederate Nazi insurrection, such as Scalia's position of the question of the Holocaust. Does a judge have the authority to stop an illegal act by superior law? And according to the American Constitution, the answer is yes. But according to the communist revolutionary white supremacists in the Confederacy, the answer is no. And thus the action of you choosing which country you're with is essential to your identity. What kind of person or entity do you seek to allow yourself to be engineered towards? Now, in the question of Odysseus directly, you have the position of Achilles, who, being a series of armors and luxuries, stopped being Achilles the moment he removed his armor in order to upgrade it into the godly armor, and thus the armor of Odysseus creating the new identity of Odysseus, similar to the function of the concept of the immortals, where one immortal will die and they're replaced by a nameless other immortal of hyper elites that don't seem to have an end in their population, similar to the function of an undead invasion, which would facilitate a threat of unending waves that will exhaust you into submission. And thus you had the capture of uh, their enemy in Troy, who then had to answer the question of who they support as the most dangerous enemy. On the one end, they had one super bear powerful man who stood as the capability of 4 or 5 powerful men as a unit by himself, and thus the action of having 4 additional people in a small space hyper accentuates the power and potential of their units from their group, or the function of Odysseus, whose orders and commands of active persuasion as temporary engagements, as his hyper control and command over his units, makes him persuasively keen, cutting bone from marrow in all of his specific strategies. And which is better? And the prisoner said in the preservation of their own life, the correct answer, according to the thing, convincing them that this was true, and thus spare their lives from being executed. And the answer was Odysseus and his command, and the hyper engagement of the specific control over the units facilitated the power of an entire group, as opposed to the hyperextension of the power of a subgroup. And the major group can be trained, and the subgroup can attached to others in a modular, adaptive way, which had been very successful as the hyper-promotion of his commands and assists facilitated extraordinary injuries against their enemies, and thus they voted for Odysseus as the more dangerous, who received as a benefit the prize amongst his fellow Grecians of Achilles' armor, which is the power of yellow light, or caution, slow down to stop, which feeds the power of green. Now, their position according to the system would have started off trying to deny it as much as possible, as the function of call signs are usually a negative, and thus the action of rizzing somebody out or harassing them or hazing them becomes the primary question of their objectives. At which point they would have actively called the character from The Legend of David in the very beginning Kid, which is a pirate that actively demanded ice cream in order to assist them, at which point, as a fun, neutral thing, becomes their original position, as David would have accelerated and proven himself in those various mechanisms. Their assertion by the plans, because the enemy has a vote, would have asserted the active experience being constructed, which is then theorized into the long-standing, overwhelming odds of wars of attrition, which would have overextended each of the things, running dry each of the resources, requiring a status quo operation of preserving all resources as much as physical possible, at the detriment of active convenience, which then would have normally already been consumed ages ago, which becomes the identity of Odysseus, which then becomes the dreaded call sign for anyone to be assigned to, which is a clear sign to all participants coming in that they are going to hate and suffer through each of the missions attached to the title head, leader, or commander of the operation. To this extent, the function of the intelligence oversight requires the active collecting of spies or the ingesting of spies and the defense and collection of the forward observers and so on, at which point these types of missions being stuck in the shit becomes an expectation in lesson of tragedy, and thus the misery compounds upon itself, and misery loves company. And to this extent, the function presumes, similar to in the act of ants, where they send the Queen's Guard in order to fight the termites, the Confederacy seeking to destroy David would have actively convinced Congress to send the intelligence oversight military police forces in order to engage in those special unique positions where it would be most likely inconvenient for the Confederates to be able to defeat inside a proxy war where the forces are directly vulnerable to fires as strategies collide into a symphony of death.